and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, a show where we talk about warbirds, history, World War II, flying, and more. Now, this show is supported by the Commemorative Air Force, which is the world's largest flying museum. This nonprofit membership organization has preserved and flown historic aircraft for more than 65 years. CAF's mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. And you can support CAF through donations, membership, and by volunteering your time and talents. You can visit commemorativeairforce.org for more information or to find the local CAF unit near you. I'm your host, Steve Buss, and we welcome everyone watching tonight. Welcome to those of you on Facebook, on YouTube, and those of you watching on GoToMeeting. If you would, please take a second to like, share, subscribe, or follow us, whatever you'd like to do. And that way you can keep up to date with the next episodes that we have of Warbird Tube. On this episode, we're going to take a look back 80 years, actually a little further than 80 years, but we're going to kind of center on one of the pivotal moments of World War II, and that is the famous Doolittle Raid on Japan and the man behind the mission. Now, before we dive into our topic tonight, if you have any questions for our guests, just put them in the chat box and we'll do our best to address them. Joining us now from her home in California, please welcome Jonna Doolittle Hoppes, Jimmy Doolittle's granddaughter. Good evening and welcome to the show.
Hi, Steve. It's good to see you again. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, you, as I said, you're Jimmy Doolittle's granddaughter, and you've written a book called Calculated Risk. I had to look behind me. Yeah. But what was the impetus for actually writing this book?
Well, I think that the real reason I wrote it was because of the Disney film Pearl Harbor. C.D. Glimes, the historian and author, passed me a copy of the original script to the movie, and in it, the character of Doolittle was portrayed as kind of a foul-mouthed, not very bright, Patton from the movie stereotype. And I'm not going to bag on Disney. Disney actually worked with us to clean up the portrayal, but I discovered two things. One, that once someone passes away, they're part of public domain, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to protect them. And the other was that the kids that are writing the movies and screenplays and television and books really didn't know much about World War II. So it started out to kind of protect his image, but quickly morphed into, well, as I told you earlier, nagging people to make sure all history is recorded.
And we'll talk more about that and your current projects, but we want to take a trip back in time to your grandfather and his very early days. Of course, he was born in California, but ended up moving to Alaska, and that sort of set up some of his early experiences, which helped form some of his personality moving forward.
He was born in 1896, and shortly after he was born, his father took off for Nome, Alaska. And in 1900, my great-grandmother moved up there with my grandfather. And as you can see, the picture on the screen right now, he used to tell us that's when he was a little girl. He was this tiny little boy with these ringlets and quickly became the target of the bullies in Alaska and Nome. And it didn't take him very long to establish himself as one of the kids. He actually learned to fight when he was in Nome. One of the other things he did was he spent a lot of time in the gymnasium, and he did a lot of acrobatics, a lot of gymnastics, and that actually played a role later in life when he was doing the aerobatic flying.
And spent a number of years in Alaska before moving back to California.
True. He came back in 1908. Actually, his family split up. My great-grandmother came back to Los Angeles. My great-grandfather never left Alaska. He stayed up there, and he was a carpenter by trade. So he remained up there for the rest of his life. He came down one time to visit. But my grandfather then attended high school at Manual Arts High School in Los Angeles. And it was during that time that he met a young lady that changed his life.
And this is one of the interesting parts of this story is that we read so much about Jimmy Doolittle, the general aviator, but there really was teamwork, a synergy between he and his wife, Jo, that really, I think, propelled them both to success.
You know, I think what people need to realize is that military spouses, all spouses, but in particular military spouses, play a tremendous role in the success of their spouses. My grandmother, I will never tell you my grandfather wouldn't have done what he did with his life, but I will tell you she made it a lot easier. And actually, she may have impacted that he did it because when they were kids, my grandmother's family was not very impressed with Jimmy Doolittle, who was kind of well, he was a solid C student and he was a professional boxer in high school. And my grandmother's family was a little bit more refined than that. And her uncle offered to send her to law school. Well, when my grandfather proposed to my grandmother in high school, and she told him that her mother would never approve, he didn't find that an issue. He wasn't going to marry her mother. But he didn't want to marry a lawyer, and she didn't want to marry a boxer. And that was a bargain they made as kids. He was a very good boxer. And again, he was professional in high school.
And how did they actually meet? I mean, just by chance in high school?
They just were in the class together. She was a straight A student. My grandmother actually had a photographic memory, and she was a straight A student. She was class secretary. She was in the drama club. And my grandfather, as I said, was he was the kid that had both toes, big toes on the line in a classroom. He pushed it a little bit.
You mentioned that there was some tension between Joe's family and the thought of her marrying your grandfather. That kind of brings this to their marriage in December of 1917. They just eloped, didn't they?
They did. She was forbidden to marry him. And so on Christmas Eve, 1917, they eloped at the county courthouse. Now, he had just finished ground school. He dropped out of UC Berkeley after his junior year and enlisted in the Army Air Corps, or in the Signal Corps as a flying cadet, and wanted to go to England or to Europe to fight in World War I. He'd finished his ground school in Berkeley and was on his way down to San Diego for flight school. Now, he was never, he was very disappointed. He never got to go to Europe to fight. He was kept in San Diego as a flight instructor, which pretty much impacted, I think, the type of pilot he was. He always liked to push himself as far as he could to master whatever he did.
And he spent a lot of time flying with a number of different students, but also in less than desirable conditions. And I understand he probably took some, well, maybe little risks as far as being a wing walker at one point.
Oh, well, yeah. He, there is a story. When I'm talking to a whole audience, I usually ask if there's anybody in the audience was officer of the day, because the first record that my grandfather really set was officer of the day. He was out flying with John McCulloch, one of his friends, and they used to take an airplane out and go away from the field, and he would climb out on the wing and do some of those gymnastic things that he did in Nome. And one day, John was trying to get him back into the cockpit. Instead of going in the cockpit, he went down and sat between the wheels. And when they landed, John was pretty upset. Granddad was thrilled because he'd won $5. But what neither of them knew was the filmmaker, Cecil B. DeMille, was filming at the field that day. And he was very good friends with Colonel Birdwell, I think his name was, Burwell. And as he's showing the rushes to Burwell that afternoon, Burwell sees this plane land with somebody sitting between the wheels, jumps up and yells, "Ground Doolittle." And DeMille says, "Well, how do you know it's Doolittle?" And Burwell said, "Nobody else is that stupid." So that's how he got officer of the day. I mean, so he pushed the envelope.
But also with pushing the envelope, he had to be one of the better flight instructors at the field, because he built up a reputation as being an excellent aviator, which led to him being sent to mechanic school, which was something that was almost unheard of at the time.
To mechanic school to mechanic school and then to engineering school. The thing about Gramps, he had this label of being kind of a daredevil pilot, but the truth was he understood the science behind it. He ended up graduating from MIT with not only his master's in aeronautical engineering, he earned the first doctorate of science in aeronautical engineering ever issued by MIT. So he was a scientist behind everything that he did. And he used to get trouble for flying in weather that other pilots wouldn't fly in. But what his commanding officer didn't realize was he flew that course so many times that he could tell you how many cows were in a given field. So he appeared to be a daredevil, but the truth was he really was the master of the calculated risk. He really understood what he was doing and thought ahead to what he might do if things went south.
And that's an important theme that runs through his entire career, is that, as you pointed out, some people looked at him as a daredevil, but in fact, he'd already, as you said, calculated the risk that would go into the different kinds of flights, and knew where the limits were, where his limits were, and didn't go past them until he was confident enough and had enough experience to go the next step, which we were talking before, there are no old, bold pilots. And he was definitely an example of someone who knew his limitations and was able to stay within them. And he had some scary times.
Oh yeah.
But it was always with a knowledge going into it. It wasn't just doing something because someone said go do that.
I think the perfect example is the outside loop. The first time he did the outside loop for public, it was considered something that was impossible to do. Well, before he ever did that, he actually studied not only the stress on the airplane, but the stress on the pilot himself. And his master's was on, the radiant stress on an airplane. So he looked like this guy that just went out and did this maneuver that nobody had ever done, but he knew the science behind it, and he had tested the theory, quite a bit before he ever did it for the public. So he wasn't the daredevil that he was labeled, but he certainly did push the envelope.
Well, and his philosophy of not performing a record attempt in front of the public until he knew he could do it came, I think, about a year before that, when he did we was trying to do a cross-country time record, and ended up rolling up his airplane on takeoff before he could even get in the air, and realized, with all the public and press there, that he was never going to do that again.
It was a guiding philosophy throughout his whole life. In fact, when he did the first blind flight, he flew it many, many times before he ever did it for the public. He flew it in fog before he ever performed it.
Now, when we say blind flight, for those who are not familiar, we take for granted airlines, private pilots being able to fly in instrument conditions, in the clouds, in fog, in poor visibility. We take that for granted as something that's it just happens these days. And there's lots of technology that keeps everyone safe, but there had to be someone somewhere who did it the first time. And that's where Jimmy Doolittle came in, and he worked with the folks from Sperry to create the actual instruments. These things did not exist. So with his knowledge, with his engineering background and his piloting background, he was able to bring this together to create this first blind flight, and it truly was.
As a kid, I asked him, Granddad, what do you feel was your greatest contribution? And he said, hands down, blind flight. It really pushed the ability of pilots to fly in weather, which they could not do before.
Right. And the picture that we're looking at now is the aircraft that he used to do the blind flight. And it's kind of hard to see, but there's a canvas that goes around the cockpit, and he actually pulled that over the cockpit so he could see nothing. He had an observer in the front seat, but he had also done this solo several times before the public unveiling of this flight.
He'd actually done it that morning. in fog before the full flight laboratory, which developed the instruments, was funded by Harry Guggenheim. And before he performed that quote stunt for Guggenheim, he flew it that morning in solid fog. Ben Kingsley, when he did the professional flight, flew in the front cockpit with his hands over his head so you could see that he hadn't touched the controls. But he was the first person to take off, fly a prescribed course, and land without ever seeing the ground.
Amazing for the time, and again, just starts the entire ball rolling with commercial aviation and airline travel that we take for granted today. So that blind flight was in 1928, correct?
28 or 29.
28, 29.
Yeah.
We've got probably have to back up a year or two before that, and that would be the trip that he had to South America to show off the Curtiss P-1, the Hawk. He was working kind of on loan to Curtiss Aircraft from the Army Air Corps at the time.
That was, that's a kind of an interesting story because the Army Air Corps lent him to Curtiss Wright in order to fly the Hawk in exhibitions in South America so that they could sell it to the air forces down there. And there's this camaraderie. I know this is going to really surprise your audience in particular. There's this camaraderie that exists in aviation that really, there's nothing that quite replicates it. And so he's down in Santiago, and he used to tell me, never drink pisco sours. You never drank pisco sours, right? No,
I actually had to look up what a pisco sour is. And it's basically South American brandy, eggs, lemon juice, and simple syrup.
Well, I listened to him. I never drank a pisco sour.
Yeah, I don't think I would either.
But anyway, so they're all down in the officers club, and they're talking about Douglas Fairbanks, this actor at the time that did all this swashbuckling in movies. And the Chilean officers were pretty impressed with this movie star, and my grandfather kind of turned to him and said, any American boy can do that. And they wanted proof. And so he handed his pisco sour to Boyd Sherman, and he did some flips and walked across the room on his hands, and the things that all American boys would do. And they cheered for him, but one of them said, Jimmy, Douglas does it on a windowsill. So Granddad had this incredible, actually, I even saw him do it. He could plant his hand and stand on one hand and then extend his body parallel to the ground. And so he went out on the windowsill and he put his hand on the windowsill and he extended his body out over the courtyard, and the windowsill gave way. And a good gymnast will land on his feet. Granddad was an excellent gymnast. He landed on his feet 2 stories down and broke both of his ankles. Again, this is a story he told me himself. He was pretty ashamed. Here he was on loan to Curtiss Wright, flying exhibitions all over South America. Anybody in his squadron would have loved to have done it. And, he was letting him down. He thought about his commanding officer who'd had faith in him, and, wasn't very proud of the fact that he pulled this stunt that had caused such an issue. And then he thought about Curtiss Wright, and those contracts depended on him flying. There wasn't anybody else down there that could fly the plane for Curtiss. And so he had clips put on his CAFs. He had Boyd take him out to the airport. He flew a couple of test flights in the plane. The CAFs started to crumble. He went back to the hotel, soaked them off, went back to the hospital for new CAFs. The Chilean doctors said, "Crazy American, go home." There was a German in Santiago that built CAFs or made CAFs for my grandfather using corset stays. And he actually flew that exhibition in the plane, flew everybody else out of the sky, won the contract for Curtiss Wright, then headed over to Bolivia. Well, the Bolivians didn't like the Chileans. They thought Gramps was a spy. He went home very quickly and spent 6 months in the hospital or in therapy, basically. His ankles never healed correctly. I can't imagine why, but they bothered him the rest of his life.
And that was about the time that he really got into into his education when he had the I guess extended sabbatical of not flying.
No, he actually had that before.
Before that, okay.
Before that, yeah. He went to I think it was 1925 when he graduated. He took 2 years, one to get his master's, one to get his doctorate.
Okay.
So he finished MIT in 2 years. So most of his career in the military, he did have a doctorate of science.
And your grandmother played a pretty large role in helping him get his master's and doctorate as well. She'd take care of the two young boys during the day, and then take care of her husband at night, typing up all of his notes from all of his research and classes in the evenings when he'd come home from school.
That's true. And quiz him. It actually became the first textbook that MIT used for aeronautical engineering. So she did. He used to say she earned it as much as he did, and she probably did.
I'm sure. You just have to be able to absorb all that knowledge as not only typing it but I can just imagine them talking about it, and her quizzing him on the things that he had learned or theories that he had. I'm sure there's some very, very animated conversations that went on.
Yeah, there's some great stories. I will tell you, go back all the way to when they first got married. She had a photographic memory, and she was hired in the port in San Pedro or down in Long Beach as the security. She knew everyone who could come in and who could leave during World War I during that period. So she was the security system down there. And she was actually making a paycheck before he ever earned a penny.
It is amazing. And not only did they take care of themselves, but also they supported your grandfather's mother and Joe's parents as well in later years, to helping them financially as well.
That's true. That's why in 1930 he actually left the Army Air Corps, left active duty, went into the reserves, skipped the rank of captain, went straight into the reserves from a lieutenant to a major, and served as a VP for Shell Oil. And his job for Shell Oil was basically the same job he had in the Army Air Corps, which was to make flying look fun, to keep it in front of the public eye so that they could finance it.
And that brings us into his career in air racing, which started with the Schneider Trophy in 1925. That's a seaplane race, if you're not familiar with it. And he had not flown seaplanes very much before he entered that race.
Yeah, he got a lot of ribbing for that. He actually, though, not only beat out all the international competition, having really no experience in seaplanes, he also beat all 3 Navy guys that were in it. And if I'm in a group, I really like to rub that in if I can. Got to be Air Force here.
There you go. And along with that, he won the Bendix Trophy in 1930 in the Laird Super Solution. Right. And in 1931, the Thompson Trophy in the GB-R1. Now, that's kind of an interesting story how he ended up flying the GB for the Granville brothers.
Well, the Super Solution was the only airplane that he ever purchased. He purchased that plane, and he and Maddie Laird went to work on it to alter her so she had retractable landing gear. And he took her up on a test flight and got the landing gear up about 2 clicks. He couldn't get it the rest of the way up. He couldn't get it all the way down. And so when he took her into the field on her belly, it tore up pretty badly, and she couldn't be flown. At this point in time, he is now one of the premier race pilots in the world. And he'd broken his airplane. Maddie, I'm losing the name of it. The brothers.
Yep.
Came up with the GB. Now the GB, I don't know how you could even call her an airplane. She's really an engine with little stubby wings on her. And he used to call her the little airplane that liked to fly upside down and backwards. And he said flying the GB was like balancing a pencil, lead point down on his finger. When he picked her up in Springfield, he climbed in, and he used to have this signature loop he would do over an airfield. He didn't bother. He took her straight to Cleveland, did a test run the next day with a pylon turn, and he was up about 5,000 feet. She did a double snap roll on him. Had he not been as high as he was, he would have lost control of her. He flew the Thompson Trophy in a circle. He no longer did the pylon turns, and by changing the pitch of the propeller and by angling his flight, he not only won the race, he set the land speed record, which, by the way, he set the sea speed record in the Curtiss plane that he flew in the Schneider Trophy.
And after the Thompson race, it really became sort of a turning point for your grandmother dealing with the media, because there had been a pilot who had been killed in a Granville GB airplane shortly before. The name was
Boyd Sherman.
Yeah, and there's a newsreel footage of it. Most people have seen it. It's the airplane snaps and bursts into flame. But at the 1931 Thompson Trophy races in Cleveland, your grandmother didn't realize it at the time, but all of a sudden she figured out that there were cameras on her and your dad and uncle waiting to see what kind of reaction there would be, because they anticipated this airplane would crash with Jimmy Doolittle on board.
They really didn't expect him to successfully fly it in the Thompson Trophy. And when my grandfather found out that the press had kept a camera on his family, he stopped racing. He refused to ever fly a closed circuit race again. He did city to city, country to country. He flew airmail. He did a lot of publicity for aviation, but he would never race again. He felt that he'd done as much as he could for racing, and that racing had done as much as it could for aviation. But he was pretty upset that they would follow his family that way.
And to put it in historical context, the air racing of the 30s was really one of the big sporting events in the nation. It was followed by people like baseball or football or even NASCAR or IndyCar. It was that caliber of sport. So there was a lot of focus on it. And when he came out and said, as you had said, that air racing has done as much as it can for aviation, those were some pretty controversial remarks at the time.
It was a small community. Aviation in the time was still relatively new, and it was a very, very small community. And it got a lot of attention because here's this new thing that can get you across country in hours, not days. And so it had a lot of attention, and you'll find a lot of the boys that served in World War II fell in love with aviation because of those early race pilots, and airplanes coming to town and 25 cents and you could get a ride. It really was the new thing.
Well, as his flights and continue to have groundbreaking implications as far as commercial aviation went, he made several trips to Germany, including one in 1939 that kind of cemented his worldview of what was coming, which was somewhat in conflict with what other folks were thinking.
Unlike Lindbergh, when Gramps, back up, he made a number of trips to Europe, and he was very close friends with Ernst Udet. And Ernst was really a premier pilot, a German pilot, an aerobatic pilot, a race pilot. My dad used to laugh and said, Ernst could do things in airplanes that nobody could do, and Daddy knew because he tried them, and they didn't work. But they had been really close friends, so Ernst would take him through the aviation factories, and he saw what they had on the drawing boards. He saw what they were creating in these aviation factories. And when he went in 1939, the planes in the air were no longer in recreation numbers. They were obviously building up for the war. And he said that the kids, when he came back, he went directly to see Hap Arnold, who not only was a commanding officer, he was a friend, and said that there was absolutely no way that we could avoid being drawn into the war in Europe, and offered to go back in uniform. He ended up in uniform that following July, and was stationed up in the Detroit area. And his job was to force a marriage between aviation and automotive industries, a reluctant marriage on both parts, but he was already in uniform before Pearl Harbor.
And Pearl Harbor is the beginning of what we now know as the Doolittle Raid. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt said, "How can we retaliate?"
Right.
And kind of started things in motion even before your grandfather knew it. The plan was sort of presented to him in very rough outline.
This is where I kind of give it back to the Navy guys, because
Yep.
you know, there are a lot of myths that surround the Doolittle Raid. And the first is that it was granddad's idea. That's not true. It actually came from a submariner, a guy by the name of Captain Lowe. And as Captain Lowe was flying over a training field where there was the outline of an aircraft carrier on the runway, as his shadow passed over that outline, he wondered if we couldn't take a land-based bomber off a carrier. He elevated it up the chain of command to Admiral King. Admiral King called General Arnold. General Arnold called him my grandfather, not because he was a hot dog pilot, because he was a scientist. And Gramps came up with the B-25, the exact same airplane that the Navy recommended. So it was, it really came from the Navy. And what made it so special is it was the very first joint ops between the Army Air Corps and the Navy. Neither of them could have done it without the other. So I had to give the Navy that, for you Navy people out there.
And this when the Hornet sailed from San Francisco, there were only a handful of people who had any idea of what the actual mission was. So secrecy was unbelievable.
Not even President Roosevelt knew. You know, even back then, they thought there might be a leak in the White House. So not happening there, because they were actually and to decided on the ship, a diplomat to Japan. So only a very small number of people knew until they got on the Hornet, and it was a day out to sea.
And of course,
I will tell you right now that the Navy guys were not kind to our guys. They really took them to task in poker. And it wasn't until it was announced that this task force is bound for Tokyo that they decided to be nice to them.
I'm sure there are some great stories that took place both before the announcement and after that are maybe lost to history, but we can only imagine the intra-service rivalry that was going on.
Well, I will tell you that in the safe on the Hornet that went down, because the original Hornet was sunk, is Raider money. Some of the boys did lose some money, and it still was in that safe when the Hornet went down.
Well, the raid itself set up for April 18th of 1942. They're discovered some 250 miles farther out to sea than they had anticipated. They decide to launch anyway. Your grandfather asks if anyone wants to back out. No one does. The raid itself, I think anyone who's read any history books or seen the movie 30 Seconds Over Tokyo knows the story, and they took off. The damage was not very much. There was not a whole lot of damage in Japan, but psychologically, the impact of the raid had ramifications that paid off later on in the war, including the Battle of Midway, which is, in June of 1942, which is another great turning point of the war. all 16 airplanes make it through Japan. 15 crash land in China. One goes to Russia, where they're interned for the war. And did your grandfather ever talk about his feelings or reactions after all of this was over?
Yeah, there's a couple stories. Granddad felt like the raid was a complete failure. Now, even though he served in World War I, this was his first combat mission. It was the first combat mission of all 80 men. And there's the picture that's on the screen right now. It's a terrible picture, but it's Granddad sitting on the wing of his B-25. It's in pieces on a hilltop or a mountaintop in China. It's being taken by his by Paul Leonard, his crew chief. And at this point, Granddad thinks, and this is a story he told me, he felt the raid was a complete loss. And Paul said to him, you know, boss, they're going to promote you to general. And Granddad kind of laughed. He said, they're going to take my airplane away. And Paul said, you know, boss, they're going to give you the Medal of Honor. And Granddad kind of laughed. He said, I'll be lucky to get a paid vacation in Leavenworth. And then Paul said to him, and Granddad said this is the highest compliment he ever received. Paul said to him, boss, they're going to give you another plane. And when they do, I want to fly with you. And I mean, so here the mission is a failure in his eyes. And his airplane's in pieces on this mountaintop. And here's this kid that says, I still believe in you. Paul did fly with him. When Granddad was transferred to North Africa, Paul was his crew chief, and he was killed protecting their plane in Algiers. His prediction also was right. Granddad was promoted to general before he left China. He went from lieutenant colonel to general. He stayed in China until he found out as much as he could about his men. 3 men died that night. 1 died when he bailed out of the plane. 2 drowned when they ditched off the coast. 8 were captured by the Japanese. Of those 8, 3 were executed by firing squad. 1 was basically starved to death. 4 of them came home. There is a marvelous, marvelous book written by C.V. Glines called 4 Came Home. It will tell you their story and what they lived through for the duration of the war. They were in solitary confinement almost the entire time. 1 crew went to Russia. There will always be a mystery around that crew. Apparently their plane was burning fuel at a higher rate than they anticipated, and they couldn't get to the coast of China. However, Ski York and Bob Emmons both were, I believe, fluent in at least ski in Russian. They both ended up in Air Force intelligence. Nolan Hernan said to me years ago, he said, I asked your grandfather one time if we were ordered to Russia, and your grandfather said, I never gave that order. He didn't deny that there was an order, but I do know that Granddad was livid that they went there. So I doubt if they were told to go, that he had any idea. But hang on. And Paul was also right about the Medal of Honor. Granddad was awarded the Medal of Honor. He had quite a heated argument with both General Arnold and General Marshall. He didn't feel that he had earned it. He thought that giving it for something like the raid cheapened it, and they outranked him. So when he received that medal from Roosevelt, he received it on behalf of every single one of the Doolittle Raiders. The medal, which is at the University of Texas in Dallas, belongs to every single one of them, not just to Gramps. He had this philosophy that everything he accomplished was accomplished because of a team. It wasn't his sole accomplishment, it was all the people that worked together. So that's the blind flight, the Doolittle Raid, his successes in the 8th Air Force. So that was one of the divine philosophies he had. When he walked out of the office, he turned to my grandmother and to General Arnold and said, I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn this medal.
And he does indeed. He ends up with the 12th Air Force in North Africa. He commands that for a period of time, followed by the 15th Air Force, getting that established in the Mediterranean, and then takes over for his friend Ira Aker with the mighty 8th in England. So
Right.
it's a progression as well. And with the 8th Air Force, he was able to put his philosophy of being strategic into more of an effect than he'd had with the 12th or the 15th.
Yeah. You know, a lot of people don't realize that he got in trouble
Hmm.
when he commanded the 12th Air Force, because he actually, as a young lieutenant, flew for Billy Mitchell and believed that the Air Force was a strategic force, or should be a strategic force. And so he used the 12th Air Force that way. They took it away from him, divided it in half, gave him the strategic half, gave someone else the tactical half. And when it came to forming the 15th, it was a strategic Air Force. So he proved that it could be used that way, and then he went on to even further prove it in some of the decisions he made with the 8th.
And some of those were a little controversial, including raising the number of missions from 25 to 30, eventually to 35. But there was, again, a scientific reason behind that.
He flew with the guys until he was briefed in Ultra, then in code breaking. He flew with his man. He would show up at the airfield with a parachute on his back and take someone's place. Never a pilot. He never took another pilot's place, but he would fly those missions. And what he discovered was the crews that had been together about 20 missions really had it down. So not only were they coming home and bringing the airplanes home, they were bringing the rookies home with them too. So he raised the missions because they were so much more effective as they got further along. The other really controversial decision he made for the bomber pilots, not for the fighter pilots, was he released the fighters from flying cover on the bombers, and they were told to simply take out the enemy wherever they could do it. And with the resistance that was met with the bomber pilots in the beginning dissolved when they found out that those fighters were taking out the opposition, and attrition was destroying the Luftwaffe. So they met less and less resistance because of that order. If you ask Bud Anderson, it's that order and that little airplane called the Mustang that changed the air war.
And not only from the American side, but also from the German side. Adolf Galland had said that when that philosophy changed, he knew that the Luftwaffe would not be able to survive.
That's true. When he visited Gramps shortly before Granddad passed, that's exactly what he said to him. That decision ended the Luftwaffe. Another thing that Granddad did, though, that made the Mustang possible is he developed 100-octane fuel. And he's the guy who pushed it through so that you could have the engines that flew the type of missions that Mustang flew.
And you have to realize at the time that he was proposing 100-octane fuel, the Army Air Corps' airplanes were flying at everything from 65 to 85. There were no engines that could burn 100 octane. And the people at Shell Oil were saying, why would we make something that no engines can use? But his philosophy was, it's almost Field of Dreams. If you make it, the engines will come. And his prediction was right.
And also, he had been visiting with the people designing airplanes. He knew the capacity that they could have. I mean, he was adding lead to his fuel way back when he was flying racing or altitude. So he knew what lead could do, and they call it Doolittle's folly, or the $1 million blunder, which actually turned into be rather helpful.
I'd say. We've got some questions that have come in for our audience. I'd like to see if you can answer some of these.
Okay.
Let's see. Well, here's one that goes to every pilot. Did he have a favorite aircraft?
The one he was flying.
There you go. That's
what he bought, though, was the Super Solution.
Right.
He really did love the Super Solution.
And for those who are not familiar with the Super Solution, the original airplane had fixed landing gear, and that's why to make it go faster, they modified it to have retractable gear, which unfortunately didn't turn out so well. But it's amazing what that airplane could have done had the landing gear actually worked.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Did General Doolittle oversee any of the production of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo? He was actually active military at the time,
He
then,
was
right?
still active military. He was in Europe and then over in Okinawa. But when Ted Lawson wanted to write the book, he reached out to Granddad, and Granddad felt very strongly that it was a good thing for Ted to do for himself. I think what most people don't realize is the Raiders became family. I grew up with all these uncles. You know, they weren't related by blood, but they were definitely family members, and they called Gramps the old man. They called my grandmother Mama Joe. So when Ted reached out to write the book, he had Granddad's blessing. And when Spencer Tracy was asked to play the role of Doolittle, he told them he'd get back to him and called Granddad and asked permission.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Speaking of your grandmother and the various houses that they had, apartments throughout the years, it was always open as a social club, basically. Your grandmother, as I read in the book, she didn't know how to cook when they first got married, but she learned quickly and learned well, was a home brewer before I knew anyone else was a home brewer. But the house was always a hub of activity. And we've got a picture, someone asked about the tablecloth. And go back and find that. So tell us the story behind that.
Okay, the tablecloth, the signatures on that tablecloth are really kind of the who's who of aviation. It started the night of the first blind flight. At that dinner, you had Boyd Sherman, his mechanic. You had Guggenheim. You had everybody involved in that flight sign that tablecloth, and then my grandmother embroidered it in black thread. She went on to everyone who broke bread at their home either signed that or eventually napkins, and then screams. So the only signature on that tablecloth that wasn't signed at dinner in their house, although he'd been there, was Orville Wright. Everybody else had broken bread at their house. The tablecloth is now at the Smithsonian. It is in a drawer. There's pictures of it that you can see, but every time I go, I kind of poke him and ask if it's ever going to be displayed, but I don't think it ever will come out into the public.
Before it was donated to the Smithsonian, how did your grandparents, did they display it somewhere in the house?
No,
or was it just something that was just, oh, they used it?
They used it. Yeah, it was a tablecloth.
Oh my gosh.
You know, if you were invited to the Doolittle home, you left, if you were famous or notorious or wealthy or poor, you left all those trappings on the doorstep, and it was an equal playing field in their home. Their home was lived in. It was a place of comfort. There were always people there. One of my biggest regrets as a child, I mean, these were just the people that came to visit Granny and Gramps. I wish now I'd listened more, because there were just phenomenal people. Some of them very famous, some of them just ordinary people who did extraordinary things in their lives. And again, I wish I'd paid more attention. It was a pretty special home, and it was a home, regardless of what the walls were, where the walls were. It was a home.
When in your life, when did you realize your grandparents' significance in history? Is it just something that was an aha moment, or something that just sort of developed as you knew the stories?
As a kid, you knew they were well known because you had the news. There was always, you know, a little hubbub around them. I didn't appreciate their contributions until I was older. I was a kid who my grandparents had a wall in their hallway actually a couple walls, and from ceiling to floor, basically it was 8 by 10 or pictures, signed autographed pictures of different people, and there were different groups. There were aviators, there were the raiders, there were, you know, people in industry. And as a kid, I would ask questions. So I learned a lot of history asking about the people in the pictures. But as far as appreciating his contributions, I really had to be an adult to realize what he had done, or they had done.
Some more questions from our audience. Is it true that the pilots and crews who made up the Doolittle Raiders were just a normal group of aviators that were in the Pacific Northwest, being the best qualified in B-25s at the time?
The B-25 was a new airplane at the time, and they were some of the only crews that were flying them. When they all volunteered, they actually, I believe it was 24 crews were trained to fly the raid. Only 16 airplanes made it on the carrier. Every crew member made it on the carrier. So when Granddad asked if anyone wanted to step down, there were backups for every single one of those crew members. The only trade was Bobby Height stepped in for the co-pilot, I believe on Farrell's, I think it was Farrell's crew, because there was a rift between the pilot and co-pilot, not because the other guy didn't want to go. And that's kind of an interesting story, because Bobby was captured by the Japanese. He spent the entire war in prison camp. And I remember asking him one time, did he regret trading out? And he said, you know, his life was one of forgiveness. He lived a life of forgiveness. I don't think of a better way to say it, but he said, no, he said, I could have been one of the crews that died flying the hump. So he never looked back with regret.
And this, I don't know why it just popped into my mind, but one of the other myths about the Doolittle Raid was that it was a suicide mission, and it really wasn't. It was planned to be take off from the carrier, bomb Japan, land in China, and then turn over the B-25s to the Chinese nationals in their defense.
That's right. You know, there's a scene in the movie Pearl Harbor where they're standing on the deck of the airplane and they've got to take off early, so they're stripping the airplanes down. That's not how it happened. They actually stripped those airplanes to minimum weight when they were in Florida. And when those airplanes took off the carrier, they had 4 bombs. The fuselage was filled with a bladder of fuel. The turret was filled with a bladder of fuel, and there were 5 men, and they weighed more than a fully loaded B-25. So they took off in a storm. They knew they were short of fuel. They each took 10 extra cans of fuel that actually they weren't jerry cans because they were too heavy. They were kitchen oil cans that were filled with fuel. And that's when they knew that there was a good chance they wouldn't make it. It's kind of an interesting story because the Emperor of Japan had promised the people of Japan that no one could ever touch the islands, that they were protected by the kamikaze winds or the divine winds. It is those kamikaze winds or divine winds that turned into the tailwinds that pushed our aircraft to the coast of China.
There are many, many interesting aspects of the story, including the number 250,000 Chinese who were killed in retaliation for helping the raiders, and that's a story that sometimes is not told with the Doolittle Raid, and it is an important point in history.
It is extremely important. Yeah, 250,000, at least 250,000 people were slaughtered, entire villages. And another thing that's really only come out recently, you have to remember that these airmen were moved from occupied China all the way over to where they could escape. And no one realized that there actually was an underground in China of people who were set up to move American pilots, not because of the raid. They knew nothing about the raid, but because of Chenault and the Flying Tigers. So there was an underground, an actual organization, loose organization that moved our pilots.
Speaking of the Doolittle Raiders, their reunions became famous through the years.
Yeah.
How many of those did you have the opportunity to attend?
I can't even remember. A lot of them over the years. And in my later years after the book came out, I was extremely fortunate to spend a lot of time traveling with a handful of the Raiders. We did a lot of programs together, and they're memories that I will treasure forever, especially Tom Griffin. He was just this amazing, amazing gentleman. Yeah, special memory. I can remember Ski York as a little kid. Ski York was the pilot who flew the plane to Russia, and he used to say to me, "Jonna, this story is not for little girls." And I would go around the corner and smash up against the wall so I could hear the story that wasn't for little girls.
Can you repeat the story?
Oh, no. It wasn't for little girls.
Just going through, was your grandfather ever involved in any of the flight tests at Edwards Air Force Base?
He actually was a test pilot, but it was at Wright Pat. Now, my uncle was a test pilot at Edwards, and as was my cousin. My Jim 3 was not only a test pilot, he was commandant of the test pilot school. In fact, at one of the test pilot dinners, one of the big dinners, they asked my grandfather, "How does it feel to know that not only are you a test pilot, but your son is a test pilot and your grandson is a test pilot?" He says, "It shows we haven't evolved very far."
I think we've kind of covered everyone's questions here. Oh, here's one just popped in. How did the life-size statue of the general come to be in the lobby of the Austin, Texas airport?
I don't know.
Okay.
I have no idea.
Well, now you have
He
something to
was-
research.
Yeah, I have my father and my uncle were both Texans. They were both born in Texas, but he had a special affinity for Texas. He did spend a lot of time at Kelly Field. So I have no idea.
There we go. The audience has stumped us. Did your grandfather ever have any ambitions to run for office?
No.
Nope.
He was apolitical. The only person he ever supported was Barry Goldwater. He simply believed that he served his country as a military officer, and politics had nothing to do with the military, so he avoided it like the plague.
So now that you've written this book, this has sort of been a snowball effect in your life, which has propelled you into not only encouraging this story to be told, but all veteran stories to be told, not only from World War II, but also current stories as well. Tell us about your latest project.
My latest project is something that I would love all of you guys to look into. About a year ago, I was asked if I would become president of the Air Force Historical Foundation. The Air Force Historical Foundation was founded in 1953 by General Tui Spots. And our goal is to preserve air power and space power history and to make it available. And we've been working on some incredible projects. Two in particular, we have access to General Arnold's archives, original dictaphones, original pictures, films, letters, and his grandson is allowing us to scan all of that and make it searchable on our website. We are also working on another project that is headed by General Mobile Homes, and that is, it's the Afghanistan project. We call it 912. Although it starts on 9/11, it talks about service of airmen, guardians, reservists, and DoD civilians, where they were, what they did from the beginning of the war in Afghanistan until our withdrawal. third project that we're working on and having a great deal of fun is we're partnering with museums. We want to be able to be a place where you come to our website and we can tell you what museums have different collections, and we can link you to their websites, so that if you're working on a research project, we can steer you to someplace like the Warbird Museum in Nampa, Idaho, that has over 3,000 Veterans History Project oral histories from World War II through the Cold War, actually through Desert Storm. So it's very heartwarming to work on something that was started, that my grandfather was a part of, and to actually bring it back to life and make it a research tool that kids can use today. So I'm extremely excited about it. We're doing a book club. We're doing, you can go to the website and find it. We're doing calculated risk on April 18th on the 75th anniversary. And the cool part about that one is my cousin Jimmy, through arm twisting and maybe, I don't know, just the power of female guilt, I talked him into joining me, and his stories about Granddad and his perspective from the military side, you don't hear very often. So I'm pretty excited about that. But yeah, it's become a passion to make sure as many stories as possible are recorded.
And what's the best way for our audience to keep up with all your different projects?
I do have a website. I haven't updated it during the COVID time, but I will start updating it. But as president of the Air Force Historical Foundation, you can always go to their website and it can tell you what we're working on, and I'm probably in the middle of it. So I feel really blessed to be able to work on something that, like I said, my grandfather touched.
It's amazing. Before we get away, we have to recognize that he was an honorary member of the Confederate Air Force at the time, the Commemorative Air Force now. And from the pictures, looks like he enjoyed his time with the CAF. What were some of the other things he did after he retired from the military?
You know, he served for every president up through President Kennedy on boards. He kept his fingers in aviation design. He worked in space. He worked with TRW. He worked with Mutual of Omaha. He really didn't retire until, forced retirement age, and he really didn't slow down until a stroke 2 weeks before he passed. So he stayed mentally active and available for all those years. He kept a secretary until 2 weeks before he passed, and still answered letters and was available.
An amazing life, both your grandfather and grandmother. As I said in the beginning, made quite a team and quite an impact, not only on history, on the United States, but of course, obviously your family.
Yeah. Well, as I said to you, I adored my grandfather, but I worshiped my grandmother. She was an incredible woman.
Jonna, any final thoughts before we wrap up tonight?
Just thank you for letting me share, and I look forward to seeing you again. It's been a while, Steve. Maybe Oshkosh next year or two.
That sounds good. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And again, don't forget to click that like, subscribe, or follow button so we can let you know about any of our future shows. And if you have any ideas for any topics you'd like to hear about, just send Leah Block an email at media@cafhq.org. Again, special thanks to Jonna Doolittle Hoppes for sharing her memories of her grandparents with us this evening. Until the next time, for the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Have a great night.
Good night.